Oh, okay. Here's a story about where Dad and I lived before before we built this house. Pause.
I can't pause. I'm letting it go.
Hello?
Oh. All right. Continue.
When we first got married, we lived in an apartment out in Shenango Township by the old Shenango Fire Hall. And it was nice. It was, a fairly new place. It was at one time a store, like a little neighborhood store that they had built onto the front of a house. And consequently, it was sort of right on the street. There was no front yard. It was like you come out the front door and there was like a sidewalk and then the street. And the same thing around the sides. It was goofy because actually the house part, the original house part had burned down and just the store survived, so they converted it into an apartment. And so that's where we lived. Well, we stayed there for about a year, and part of the reason that we left was all we were doing was paying rent and had a bunch of canceled checks. We were not building up any equity. So another reason that we got out of there was there was like a utility room behind the kitchen. And I used to cook a lot with Crisco because my mother did. So I knew not to dump that down the drain. And I had a coffee can out there in this little utility room where I would dump the grease. And then when the can was full, I'd throw it away. Well, one day I went out there and it was like, this is odd, because the lid of the coffee can had a hole in it, but it was jagged. It wasn't like it melted from the heat of hot grease. It was jaggy, and there's little pieces of plastic around the can. Couldn't figure that one out. Well, a couple nights later, we're in bed and I hear this scratching noise, scratching in the wall right by the headboard of the bed. And lo and behold, long story short, Dad set some mouse traps. And this one night, he goes out into the utility room and comes walking past the bedroom where I'm sitting on the bed with the scratching in the walls. And he has this thing. And I said, oh my, that's a really big mouse. And he said, Barb, that's not a mouse, it's a rat. We had sewer rats because of where the house was located. It was real close, to the street where the sewer was. And so these sewer rats were getting in the house, and that's what ate the lid off of the can from Crisco. Yuck. Well, that was it. We had to find a place to live. So we didn't have a whole lot of money. We had very little money. And so we start looking, and there was this one house, and when we drove to it, we didn't even go all the way to where the house was. We said, oh, hell no. We don't want this place. So we drove away. And I guess at some point we must have decided, yeah, we better go look at it. The address was Bradner Avenue. I still remember the number. It was 1619. You know me and numbers. I remember numbers. So we must have gone to look at it, because I don't think we would have bought this thing sight unseen. But the kicker was there was no Bradner Avenue. The only access to this house was an alley behind the house that you sort of drove. It was like a very steep hill downward, and then you made a sharp right-hand turn, and the house then was to the left, down a hill again. No front, or there's a front yard, but there was no street there. The front yard butted up against the neighbors on the next street, which was actually a street, it butted up against their backyards. Well, this house was, like, no, we're not going to live there. So one day I'm at work. I was on clinical, and I get paged to meet my husband in the lobby. So I go down to the front lobby, and there's Dad sitting there with some papers in his hand, and he said, "Here, sign this." And I said, "Well, what is it?" "Just sign it." I said, "Well, what am I signing?" "We're buying that house." I said, "What house?" "That one on Bradner Avenue, because it's the only one we could afford." Do you know what we paid for that first house that we could afford? $8,900. I mean, you can't even buy a friggin' used car for that, let alone a house. Well, this house was quite unique. It was, I refer to it as a train, because it was an old 2-story house with one room in front of the other. There was this tiny little kitchen, and in that kitchen, what we used for our kitchen table was a card table. We didn't even have like a real table. We had a card table, but we had a dishwasher. I do remember that. We must have had it. I think we did have it in the house, the apartment on Bradner Avenue, or on Washington Street there. So we brought that. And that's when we bought our Harvest Gold appliances. So it had a dining room and living room. And on the second floor, there were 3 bedrooms. But at the top of the steps, it was odd, because there was a door. Like, who has a door that closes at the top of their steps? Well, we figured that one out when winter came, because it was like a wind tunnel. This cold air would blow down the steps from upstairs and freeze us out. You couldn't even sit in the living room because it was so damn cold. That's why they had the door there. The bathroom was unique too. It was actually kind of nice, because it had one of those old tubs with feet. That was nice and big, and you could sit in it and soak. That was back in the day when I could actually get in and out of a bathtub. It was painted. A lot of the paint in this house was dark green. They must have gotten it. Sort of reminded me of the picnic shelters at Gaston Park. I think whoever owned it must have brought paint home from work and painted all kinds of stuff this dark green. Inside of drawers, in the bathroom was green. It was just like everywhere. So we decided we had to do something to fix this place up. So we started like stripping woodwork, which had multiple coats of paint on it. I remember the product was called Zip Strip, and you would paint it on, and it would make the paint bubble up, and then you scraped it off like with one of those tools that's just flat. I don't even know what it's called, like a putty knife kind of thing. And it would only reveal another coat of paint. There must have been like 30 coats of paint on the doors, and the banister we took totally apart. Your dad numbered it so we'd know which piece went where, and all these pieces it took forever. So after we get this done, then he decides, nah, it's not worth it. The woodwork was kind of crappy. So we decided to panel, or he decided to panel the living room and dining room. So we did that. So I did learn a lot, about how to do paneling and what different kinds of tools were called. Like, that's where I learned what a miter box was and how you cut angles and made things fit, and a coping saw. It's like weird. And the ceilings, we put that acoustic tile. And I was still going to school at that time at YSU. And I came home one night, and the dining room was pretty much done, close to being done. And I walk in, and the ceiling's gone. It's all down. And I said, "Where'd the ceiling go?" Well, Dad said as he got closer to the end, it wasn't coming out perfectly. So he took it all down and started over again. So we did that. We put new windows, put siding on the outside. I mean, did a lot of work on this house. Another of my favorite parts of the house was the basement, because that's where our washer and dryer were. And it was okay, except if it rained, because the house was so old. The foundation, the cement block or whatever it was they used it back then, had holes in it because it had worn away. And when it would rain, number one, I had to wear boots down the cellar because there was all this water, and the water would squirt out of the walls like a little water fountain, like little stream of water that comes out of a fountain. You'd see all these streams all over the place. So I don't know what Dad used on some kind of cement stuff to patch up the holes so that you did not have to wear boots when you went down the cellar. So we spent a lot of money and about 5 years fixing this house up, and then we decided it was time to sell it, get some money out of it, and build a house. So we started, talking to contractors and whatnot, and we chose a contractor, picked out a house we wanted, we got property, and then we put the house up for sale. And this was like in May. And the house, we thought it would take forever to sell. Well, it didn't. It took like 2 days. These people that were neighbors that lived sort of at the top of the hill that you had to drive down the alley, down the hill to get to our house. They bought it. And it was like, really? Like, we didn't know these people. They weren't friendly, but they must have seen all the work we put into the house and they decided to buy it. So consequently, here we are. It's May. I think the closing, we had to be out by the end of the month. And our new house, they weren't even going to start it until the middle of June. Hadn't even dug a shovel full of dirt. And there we have our old house sold and no place to live. So we ended up living with Grandma Davis. And that was fun in itself. But that's sort of how we came to get a new house, because we took a chance and bought an $8,900 house, put a lot of money into it to get it fixed up, to sell it. So at least instead of just a bunch of canceled checks, we had, got some money out of it. I still remember the first night we were there in the house on Bradner Avenue, and we went to bed, and I told Dad, I said, Ron, I have a question. He said, what? I said, are we going to live here forever? Because it was like, maybe for a few years I could handle it, but not for very long, because it wasn't, it was a crappy location. The people, you didn't really have neighbors, Well, there was a house next to us, and the guy was friendly, but his wife, I don't think she ever came out of the house. I really don't remember ever seeing her. But certainly not the kind of neighborhood where you want to spend most of your life. We were far better off when we moved up here. So God knew what he was doing, because, it was like I didn't get pregnant until after we moved out of that place. So at least I didn't have to bring new life into that dump of a house. But, it actually ended up looking pretty decent by the time we were done. So that was our first house and our venture into real estate. And I guess, the moral of the story is, don't rent a house that's right on the street, because you get sewer rats. So that's how we came to have our house up here on Overhill Drive, with nice neighbors and good people and a decent place to live. And that's where you came. You came into the new house, because you were born like 6 months. We moved here in January and you were born in June, so you always lived in the new house. So that's a story of what our first living arrangements were.